So I tell my rebellious little daughter to go wash her hands before dinner. And what does she do? She bucks up and says, "No, Daddy, Jesus told me I don't have to." So I'm like, "Hey, show me in the Bible where he said that." And then she did. Today, on another episode of the Bible in 1 Year with the Preacher's Husband. Today, we're going through Matthew chapter 15 and Mark chapter 7. Tomorrow, we're going to go through Matthew chapter 16, Mark chapter 8, and Luke chapter 9, verse 18 through 27. So, what is all this talk about dinner? Let's get into it today. So, this section is talking about traditions in both Matthew and Mark today. And Jesus was approached by Pharisees and scribes from Jerusalem who asked him, "Why do your disciples break tradition of the elders? For they don't wash their hands when they eat." Gross, right? Isn't that kind of nasty? Well, not really. So Jesus answered them, "Why do you break the commandments? Because of your tradition." Well, here's the deal. What was the tradition of hand washing here? Well, the Mishnah devotes an entire tractate of Jewish law to a discussion on how the hands should be washed. The good Jews were expected to perform ritual hand washings before, during, and after each meal. A person would first pour water over his hands with the fingertips pointing up and with the water reaching all the way down to the wrist. And then they would point the fingers downward and then pour water over them again, allowing the time for the water to drip off of the fingers. Now, if one mixed up the order or poured the water both times with the hands pointed down or up in the same direction, the hands were still ritually unclean. Now, each hand had to then be rubbed together with the other, but only after you have washed both of them in that direction in that way, and then you would rub them together. To neglect the first or the third washing was considered a very serious sin and possibly a deadly one. And such washing was not prescribed by the Old Testament law, though. In the Old Testament, nowhere do you see this, but this was a tradition that was passed down to first century Jews by their elders. Now, many teachers gave these human traditions an authority that was equal to that of commandments. We see that in a lot of denominations and a lot of churches where they give reverence to doctrine as opposed to actual biblical scripture and what we're supposed to be doing. They, I don't know, just add things to it and say, you got to do this, even though these are human laws and not laws of God. So Jesus taught that the authority of the scriptures trumps all human traditions, and he condemned the Pharisees and the scribes for valuing human tradition above scripture, especially when he says, "Why do you break God's commandment? Because of your tradition," there in verse 3. And he talks about honoring your mother and your father. Well, Jewish law required sons to care for their aging parents. That's kind of an expectation that a lot of Americans today have, even though that's not necessarily a Christian tradition. It's just an expectation in our cultures at some point that people get old and they're going to need somebody to take care of them, right? Now, however, corrupt priests back then allowed sons who were tired of caring for their parents to take a vow of Corban. Now, this vow dedicated to God and to Jerusalem and the temple the resources that they would otherwise have used to support their parents. In other words, they could go pay the money that they would have used to take care of their parents to get out of having to do it. And they would give those resources to the church, so to speak. So since one's obligation to God truly outweighed all the other obligations, the priest taught that such a maneuver was righteous and good. But Jesus, however, here strongly condemns this. He says, absolutely not. This is not right. Never did Jesus teach that he wants you to neglect your elders or even neglect your children or your family in any way. In verse 11 it says, "It's not what goes into the mouth that defiles a person, but what comes out of the mouth. This defiles a person." Remember that scene? "Oh, Fudge, only I didn't say fudge." And he got his mouth washed out with soap. So, clearly what Jesus is referring to here was not being clean and being purified physically. He's talking about the spiritual. He's talking about what comes out of your heart is what defiles a person. What's in your heart is what defiles you, not what goes in your mouth. So the laws regarding purification of the hands here were concerned with ritual purity, not sanitation. It's talking about the heart. And after all, Jewish law permitted the water to be drawn from vessels that were made of cow manure. So further, it permitted the water to be so filthy that even cattle would refuse to drink the water that they were using to wash their hands with. That's kind of gross, isn't it? I think that's pretty nasty. But Jesus argued that food consumed with unpurified hands does not spiritually defile a person. The words that proceed from the mouth defile a person because they show the sinful condition of your heart. Now, that the Pharisees took offense at Jesus' teaching suggests that they understood that he was referring to their own hypocritical speech, which honored God even as their hearts refused to worship him. So even though the things you do may be honoring God, if your heart is not worshiping God, it's still not right, is it? And then, of course, he goes on to verse 14 when he says, and if the blind guide the blind, both will fall into a pit. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. Some healings happened here, but in verse 20, this is where it really gets real. These are the things that defile a person, but eating with unwashed hands does not defile a person. This is that thing that I have. This is that verse that I haven't taught my rebellious daughter yet. Because if I had, that conversation I told you about at the very beginning probably would be reality. No, we never really had that conversation. She didn't really say that to me. But I know in my daughter, if I had showed her this verse in the Bible, eating with unwashed hands does not defile a person, she would surely use that against me every single time because I know her. So, now, we move on. After a few healings that happened here, we get to Jesus feeding the 5,000 again. Wait, no, the 4,000? He only feeds 4,000, not 5,000? Trust me, this is a completely different feeding. Now, this miracle that's listed here in Matthew and in Mark, we'll get that one tomorrow in chapter 8 in Mark. It's similar to the previous feeding of the 5,000, but it's a little bit different. He used loaves and fishes, and he satisfied the people so completely that leftover pieces were collected, just like in the first one. But the one notable difference here is the audience. The first miracle was performed for Israelites. This miracle of the feeding of the 4,000 was performed with Gentiles, so non-Israelites. So he's fed the 5,000 Israelites, and now he's fed 4,000 more Gentiles. And why? Because Jesus came for everybody. Even you and even me. Yes, even crazy old me. So I hope this has helped you with your studies today. If it has, click that like button and subscribe button. And of course, click the little jingle bell so you can get notified the next time I upload a video, which will be tomorrow for another episode of the Bible in 1 Year with the Preacher's Husband. We'll see you then.